You know, driving this road in the daytime, it's one thing, it's just a road. But at night, it changes. The air doesn't just feel cool, it feels heavy, like a blanket, and the wind you felt in the day just disappears. It gets so quiet, all you can hear is the hum of your own engine and the sound of your own thoughts. We just left my aunt's 9 night. It's about 2 in the morning now, and we're coming back in a few hours for the funeral. But right now, the night feels alive in a different way. If you really listen, you start to hear it. The chirping of the crickets and beetles, that's the soundtrack out here. And if you look close into the bush, you'll see them. The little flickers of light, the peeny wallies, dancing in the darkness, appearing and vanishing like tiny lost spirits. And when the last street light from town fades away in your mirror, and you see that mist creeping down from the blue mountains, wrapping itself around the trees, that's when it hits you. That's when you understand exactly what our grandparents meant when they'd look out into this same darkness, shake their heads, and say in that serious, low tone, "Child, dis ya is Duppy country." So, as we settle in for this long drive back to Kingston, let me share with you some of the stories that belong to this darkness, the ones that have been passed down for generations, the stories that once upon a time would have kept you wide awake, listening to every little sound on a night just like this. You see this darkness out here? It has a memory, and the stories it remembers best are the ones about people who thought they could get away with anything in life. Let me tell you about a man from a district not far from here, a man named Samuel. Samuel wasn't just a butcher, he was the butcher. His shop sat in the heart of a busy market, always noisy, always full of the scent of fresh meat and smoke from the nearby stalls. But Samuel had a reputation that made people uneasy, for 2 things above all: the frightening sharpness of his cleaver and the cruel dishonesty of his scale. He'd sell a pound of meat that was really 12 ounces, slipping old, spoiled goat into the fresh and telling customers it was specially seasoned. Once, he even sold tainted meat to the school kitchen, and when the children got sick, he just shrugged and said, "Pickney stomach weak." Everyone knew he was wicked through and through, a man who believed the only power that mattered was the one he held in his own 2 hands. Then came the night Samuel died, sudden, quiet, after a heart attack, and the whole district seemed to pause, almost holding its breath. Later that night, as his body was prepared for burial, people living near the cemetery swore they heard something different in the wind. Not the usual whispers of the trees or the chirping of insects. No, this was the clinking of metal against stone. Clink, clank. They locked their doors tighter and whispered that Samuel's earthly spirit wouldn't rest easy. Now fast forward 3 years. A young man named Mark, a good-hearted carpenter from Claremont, was riding his old Yamaha bike back from visiting his girlfriend. He was taking this very road, right through Irons Mountain, thinking about marriage, about building a family, a future. But then the bike coughed, sputtered, and died. Silence swallowed the night. No phone signal, no traffic, just the moon watching coldly from above. He cursed his luck and began pushing the heavy machine along the gravel, each step loud in the quiet, the only sounds his labored breathing and the crunch of tires on stones. And that's when he heard it. A faint sound at first, almost swallowed by his own effort. Clink. Then a pause, long enough to make him doubt his ears. Then, clank. Heavier, closer, a sound that made the hairs on his neck rise. The metallic thrum of a massive, heavy chain being lifted and dropped echoed through the bamboo. Then came the smell. Not rotten eggs alone, but the scent of a butcher's block that hadn't been scrubbed in decades, mingled with the metallic tang of old blood. And beneath it, something fouler, greed, gone rancid, a stench of selfishness and cruelty. Mark froze. His bike toppled with a crash that seemed to shatter the night, and from a side track between the bamboo, it stepped out. This was no ordinary bull. This was wickedness made flesh. Its hide wasn't merely black, it was a void, a piece of night torn loose, devouring moonlight and reflecting nothing back. Its eyes were not red, they were furnaces, burning with a cold, ancient fire that seemed to pierce straight through him. The chain around its neck, thick, cold iron, each link a sin in itself, scraped and sparked against the asphalt, hissing like a living thing. It lowered its head, horns like polished obsidian gleamed faintly, and a low, guttural sound rumbled from its chest. It wasn't a moo, it was a word, formed from malice, brimstone, and possession. Mine. It was the voice of possession, the voice of a man who took whatever he wanted. Mark was paralyzed, his future dreams shriveling in the face of that past sin. But in the corner of his mind, his grandfather's voice, frail but firm, cut through the terror. The rolling calf is wickedness, but it is bound by older rules. With trembling hands, Mark fumbled in his pocket. He found an old penknife and a single sweat-damp $5 coin, an offering, a payment. He threw the coin into the bush. It landed with a faint tink. The rolling calf's hellish eyes followed the sound for a moment, a flicker of its old greedy instinct, but then its gaze snapped back to Mark. The offering wasn't enough. It wanted more. It wanted him. It took a step forward. The chain screeched like a tortured soul. Pure panic seized Mark. He dropped to his knees. With the penknife, he scraped frantically at the dirt of the road, carving a line, then another, forming a rough, desperate cross right there between him and the beast. The rolling calf stopped. It was just a scratch in the earth, but it was a symbol it could not cross. It stomped its hoof. The ground shook. A blast of hot, sulfurous air, the very breath of corruption, hit Mark in the face. He gagged. The creature bellowed in frustration, a sound that tore at the night, but it did not cross. It just stood there, staring with those hateful, knowing eyes, as Mark, finding strength born of sheer survival, righted his bike and stumbled backwards. He walked for what felt like a mile, never turning his back, until the lights of a roadside shop finally broke the darkness. They found him the next morning, slumped on a bench, still shaking. The smell of sulfur was woven into his clothes, into his hair, a stench that took days to wash away. He sold his bike that very week, and he never, ever drove this road at night again. They say the rolling calf is a lesson, a warning that the wickedness you cultivate in life can become the chain you drag in death. Samuel thought his power was in his sharp knife and his dishonest scale, but his true legacy is that thing out there in the dark, a ghost of greed, forever hungry and forever bound to the roads he once walked. Clink, clank. Night draped over the hills like a heavy, restless cloak, and even the wind seemed to hesitate, unsure whether it dared to stir. This is the hour when some of the oldest stories come alive, the ones whispered to children to keep them close to home, the ones mothers mutter under their breath while rocking their newborns. Not every tale is born from greed or violence. Some are born from hunger, from obsession, from a curse that stretches far beyond human understanding. Some come from a woman, or what she becomes, who walks unseen through the darkness, whose very presence can chill the blood of those who do not know the rules. There's a narrow path winding past the edge of Beechamville, Claremont, where the trees huddle close and the moonlight barely dares to enter, locals warn. Do not travel here after midnight, for in this darkness lives the old Higue, an old woman by day, frail and bent with age, but by night she sheds her skin, hiding it safely in a calabash. Uncovered, she transforms into a ball of fire that hunts the night for something pure and irresistible, the blood of infants, the sweet scent of life itself. It happened to a young mother named Althea. She had just given birth to her first child, a boy with dark, curling hair and skin that smelled of new beginnings. Her nights were already sleepless, filled with the quiet awe of new life and the nervous whispers of her mother and grandmother, who spoke of Beechamville and the old tales they'd been told as children. One night, as the wind rose and the crickets fell silent, Althea awoke to a faint scratching at her window. At first, she thought it was just a branch. Then came the soft, almost musical hiss of fire moving through the darkness outside. She froze, her heart hammering as the temperature in the room seemed to drop. There, outside the small cracks in the shutters, she saw it, a ball of red-orange flame moving with intention, like a living eye that sought something only she could smell. Her grandmother had warned her, rice and salt, always rice and salt. Althea's hands shook as she reached for the handful of rice scattered along the doorway. She spilled it quickly, and as the grains hit the floor, the sound carried through the room like a tiny bell. She could see the creature pause, hovering over the window. And then it began, counting, meticulous, methodical. Every grain of rice, numbered, measured, and recorded by unseen, obsessive hands. The old Higue was trapped in her compulsion, distracted, delaying her inevitable return to human form and her relentless hunt. Althea whispered prayers, sweat streaking her face, her body pressed close to the floor. The flame flickered angrily, spinning and hissing, a dry, bitter laugh carrying through the dark. You think I like all this stupidness, gallivanting all night without skin, burning myself out like cane fire, to frighten the foolish? And for what? A few drops of baby blood? If only babies didn't smell so nice. If I could only stop hearing the soft, soft call of that pure blood running in new veins, singing the sweet song of life, tempting an old, dry-up woman who'd been holding her final note for years, afraid of the dying hum. It was her, the old Higue herself, bitter, irritated, a voice that seemed both human and something older, something beyond the living. She spoke of her hunger, of the curse that would never let her die as long as babies were born, as long as mothers feared the dark. Then again, she hissed, if I didn't fly and come to that fresh pulse in the middle of the night, how would you, mother, name your ancient dread? Who would you blame for the murder inside your own head? Believe me, as long as there are women giving birth, a poor old Higue like me can never dead. Althea held her breath. She did not move. She did not blink. The creature's fiery form twisted in frustration, the counting of rice dragging on endlessly until the first rays of dawn began to touch the roof. Slowly, inexorably, the flame diminished, retreating, melting back into the old woman who would hide her skin and wait for another night. The danger passed, but the warning remained. Some things, some creatures, are bound to the night, and their memory lingers in the shadows, waiting for the next careless soul. By sunrise, Althea collapsed beside her child, trembling, aware that the story of the old Higue was no mere tale. It was alive in the dark, patient, eternal. And in these hills, the night remembers everything. But the old Higue is more than a tale whispered to frighten children. She's a warning that carelessness, neglect, or disrespect for life, even the tiniest spark of it, can call forth things older than memory. And as long as mothers fear the dark and infants are born, she will fly, waiting, patient, eternal. As the car winds deeper into the hills, the road feels almost alive, narrow, twisting, and stubborn, like it's been here longer than the memories themselves, I swear. Some of these potholes are the same ones I remember as a kid, when I'd be sitting in the back seat, head leaning on the window, watching the mist roll through Irons Mountain. My uncle would grip the steering wheel tight, dodging potholes like he was dancing with the road itself, laughing every time he missed one. Two cars can barely pass each other here, and yet somehow they always do. One hugging the edge, the other brushing the hillside, both drivers pretending not to notice how close they came. The air carries that familiar countryside mix, damp soil, freshly cut grass, and the faint tang of cow manure drifting from a nearby field. It's the kind of smell that clings to the morning fog and reminds you you're far from town. Every corner brings back flashes. The same old stone walls half swallowed by vines. The same wooden sign leaning just the way it always did. The same silence that settles once the engine cuts. It's strange how a road can hold memories like that. How it can feel like it's watching you come back, waiting to see if you still remember. And just when you start thinking it's only the road that remembers, that's when the stories start again. The next one is about something people in these parts still whisper about. They call it the 3-foot horse. The road narrows again as my family and I leave Irons Mountain behind, winding toward Golden Grove, the kind of road that makes you hold your breath each time a truck comes around a corner. The headlights slice through the fog, revealing more potholes than pavement, and that faint, familiar countryside scent lingers, wet earth, cow manure, and old wood smoke rising from some hidden farmhouse. The night here feels thicker, heavier, as if the hills themselves are holding their breath. They say that once you cross into Golden Grove, the wind changes, not in sound, but in what it carries. If you listen closely enough, you might hear it. A distant yip, like a cry half lost between laughter and pain. That's when the elders would tell you, don't walk alone after dark, and whatever you do, don't answer when you hear the whoop. For this is the hunting ground of the 3-foot horse, a beast born of nightmare and memory. A horse with only 3 legs, 1 foreleg and 2 back legs, yet faster than any living thing. Its eyes burn red like fresh coals, and its breath, hot, poisonous, fatal to anyone struck by it, scorches the ground it passes. And yes, moonlight won't save you, because this creature doesn't fear it, but even that isn't the worst of it. No, it's the rider you must fear, the whooping boy. They say he was once a slave boy, a cow herder who died in pain, whipped and broken under a master's cruelty, his spirit twisted, corrupted by the agony he carried into death. Now, he rides the 3-foot horse across the hills, his long hair wild in the wind, his eyes glowing the same furious red as his steed's. He cracks a phantom whip through the night, and every whoop echoes like a cry from the past, a sound that freezes the blood and drives even the bravest man to his knees. In the fields, cows still startle at the sound of it, snorting and stamping, as if they remember something they were never meant to forget. Some say you can hear him clearest in August, others say just before Christmas during John Conu season, when the air feels restless and the moon rides high over the cane fields. He's been seen dancing on twigs in the bush, laughing as if the very woods belong to him. One old man from Golden Grove told me that long ago, a traveler heard the sound while riding home late. First came the galloping, uneven, 3 sharp beats against the earth. Then the whoop, long, drawn out, and hollow, like a ghost calling through a conch shell. By the time he turned to look, all he saw was a blur of flame-red eyes and a shadow that moved faster than thought. The next morning, they found his horse in the road, dead, its mane singed, its body cold. But the man was gone. Only his hat remained, turned inside out. People here don't walk after dark anymore. Children are kept indoors when the wind starts howling through the bamboo, and when a cow bawls in the middle of the night, the old folks just mutter, "Himmed about again." And if you thought you'd escaped, think again. The wind might be coming back, blowing its bad breath, hunting the memory of what it lost. Climb a tree or stay in the shadow of a heavy branch. That's your best chance. If you ever find yourself caught on that lonely road under a silver moon, and you hear the galloping of something that shouldn't be running, Don't look back, don't call out. Just pray that the whooping boy passes you by. They say the 3-foot horse and whooping boy are more than tales whispered to frighten children. They are a warning that cruelty, suffering, and injustice never truly die. The pain we ignore, the horrors we forget, ride on through the hills and the night, waiting for those who think the past is gone. In Golden Grove, when the wind starts to whoop and the moon rides high, some say he's still out there, patient, eternal, hunting the memory of what was lost. The night holds its breath as my family and I move along the narrow path, the shadows of the trees stretching long and still. Somewhere in the hills, a tiny spider is plotting. If you're not careful, you might witness it yourself. I leaned forward slightly, peering into the shadows as the trees stretched along the path, trying not to breathe too loud. Anansi, the spider, is more than a character. He is a spirit of wit, cunning, and survival. Born in the minds of the Akan people of West Africa, His stories crossed the ocean with enslaved Africans and took root in Jamaica and the Caribbean, becoming a lifeline of culture, a guide for survival, and a spark of hope in a world built to strip people of their power. One night, hunger gnawed at him, and cleverness burned in his mind. Anansi knew that even the smallest creature could turn a feast into a victory. He took up his handbasket and a large pot and made his way down to the seaside. The wind tugged at his clothes, carrying the salt scent of the sea, and the distant lap of waves whispered against the shore. He built a fire, set the pot upon it, and called out to the fish, "Come, big fish." And they came, shimmering in the firelight. "Big fish go, little fish come," he muttered, catching more until his pot and basket brimmed full. He ate his fill, savoring the victory, before hiding the pot in the bush and carrying only the basket back along the darkened path, each step stirring fallen leaves and twigs, the night alive with crickets, distant owl calls, and the faint brush of the wind. But Anansi was not alone. Tiger was strong and cruel, known to crush anyone who crossed him, and Anansi's mind had to be faster than Tiger's fists. When Tiger appeared, his rough voice cut through the night. "What you have in that basket, Sa?" Anansi's voice was small and feeble, but his mind raced. "Nothing, Sa. Nothing, Sa." Tiger passed, but then lurked in the shadows, watching. Anansi lowered himself beneath a tree, inspecting his catch. Tiger leapt from his hiding place, claws for possession, but Anansi was quicker. He pulled fruit from the tree, teasing and distracting the larger man. Then, with a flick of movement, Anansi darted to the tree, twisting around the trunk as Tiger struggled. Strips of bark snapped in the dark as he tied Tiger's long hair to the tree, and the heavy man thrashed against it, grunting and cursing. Anansi couldn't help a little chuckle as Tiger flailed, tangled like a goat in the brush. "See how Anansi tie Tiger. See how Anansi tie Tiger. Tie him like a hog. Tiger. See how Anansi tie Tiger. Tie him like a hog. Tiger." Tiger's frustration echoed through the night, mixing with the rustle of leaves, the crack of snapping twigs, and the distant call of an owl. Anansi left, victorious, slipping silently back into the darkness, the chill night air brushing against him as if the hills themselves were watching. These tricks weren't just for laughs. For generations, Anansi's cunning taught that cleverness could be a lifeline in a world built to crush the small and powerless. And tonight, as we pass through these hills, he may be closer than you think, watching, waiting for the next story to unfold. I hope you're not just sitting back and enjoying the drive. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more journeys like this. And hey, pass this video to someone who might enjoy seeing Jamaica's soul through the window of a car. We're deep in the heart of St. Anne Parish, the same parish that holds Ocho Rios, but far from the beaches and crowds. Golden Grove lies inland, a quieter side of Jamaica that time seems to have forgotten, where the hills rise in shadows and the winding roads carry stories centuries old. As I focus my camera, capturing the night around us, shadows stretch along the hills, the leaves rustling softly under our tires, a distant horse's whinny carried by the wind, the creak of old gates in the ruins ahead, whispering through the darkness. This is the land where Lewis Hutchinson, the so-called Mad Doctor, arrived from Scotland around 1760, choosing the remote Pedro district rather than bustling Kingston or Spanish Town. Here, he ran a sugar plantation, raised cattle, and became embroiled in local disputes, including a violent feud with Dr. Jonathan Hutton, showing early signs of cruelty that would define him. Hutchinson claimed the title of doctor, though whether he ever had formal medical training is unclear. Some say he may have forged credentials to gain respect and status in the colony. He became notorious for murdering travelers who passed near his estate or those he invited inside his fortified home, Edinburgh Castle, a stone structure with 2 circular loopholed towers. He would shoot from the battlements, lure victims to wine and dine, and dispose of their bodies in a deep sinkhole on the property, later called Hutchinson's Hole, nearly 98 meters deep. When authorities finally captured him after he shot a soldier attempting to arrest him, they discovered a grisly collection of items, including 43 pocket watches, yet no evidence he ever pawned any belongings, suggesting he kept trophies of his crimes. His reign of terror lasted roughly 12 years, ending with his execution by hanging in Spanish Town Square in March 1773, his arrogance knowing no bounds, even demanding an inscription for his tombstone that was never granted. But Hutchinson wasn't the only kind of monster these hills saw. This was plantation country, where hundreds of enslaved Africans labored under brutal conditions, producing wealth for men who treated human lives as property. Hutchinson's madness may have stood out, but the system around him was just as cruel. I tighten my grip on the camera, heart skipping as the ruins loom ahead, the wind whispering through the towers, the rustle of leaves underfoot, and the distant creak of gates blending with the shadows, reminding me that these hills themselves were watching. Some say the peony wallies that glow near the ruins aren't insects at all. They're restless spirits, tiny lights marking where victims still wander, searching for peace. This is why I love these drives, not just for the beauty, but for the stories buried beneath it, the hidden chapters of Jamaica you'd never find in a brochure. And ahead, as the hills curve and the road winds deeper into St. Anne, more secrets wait, ready to reveal themselves if you're willing to look closely, capturing the past one frame at a time. You never really know a place until you move through its night. The resorts, the beaches, they fade behind us as we exit the T3 and merge onto the A3 Mandela Highway, the dark country roads of St. Catherine slipping into shadows. The highway stretches ahead, quiet, empty, humming beneath the tires. A lone truck flashes past, its headlights carving brief streaks across the dashboard, and somewhere in the distance, a faint dog bark echoes off the hills, joined by the soft rustle of leaves from a roadside tree. Shadows shift across the interior as the light from passing signs flickers, tiny hints that life never truly sleeps here. The cool leather of the seat beneath me, the vibration of the tires on the highway beneath my feet. Even at 3 a.m., Jamaica has a pulse. You can feel it more than you can see it. Settlements, old estates, forgotten paths linger just beyond the shoulder, the past brushing against the present. The echoes of hills where centuries-old stories are still whispered in the shadows. Have you ever felt a city's presence before you even saw it? Can you imagine how these hills must have looked centuries ago? Tiny hints of neon signs from a rum shop or corner store flash briefly as we pass, life quietly stirring even in the darkness. As the hills flatten and the first streetlights glow ahead, the energy shifts. The highway widens, and Kingston waits just beyond the darkness, ready to reveal its rhythm, its stories, its heartbeat. If you're listening closely, and if you want to see this route in full daylight, I've done 2 other drives into St. Anne, one heading toward Irons Mountain near Claremont, and another into Ocho Rios. The same road, but a completely different world. Thanks for making it this far. If you're still with me, we're coming to the end of our drive. Let me know what you liked most about the journey tonight, whether it was the stories, the silence, or just seeing Jamaica in a different light. There's a silence you only find on these roads after midnight. Out here, the stories we've shared tonight, the rolling calf, the old Higue, the 3-foot horse, even Anansi, stop being just stories. They become echoes of fear, cunning, and survival, stitched into the very soil of St. Anne, into St. Catherine, and across the parishes of Jamaica. And long before the lights appear, you start to feel Kingston pulling you in. The air gets warmer, the wind shifts, and the road smooths out like it knows exactly where you're going. The darkness thins, the hills flatten, and that familiar city hum rises softly in the distance, with the first glow of Kingston stretching over the horizon. And that's why I keep driving these roads. Not just to witness the night, but to feel it. To feel the pulse of generations, the resilience of the people who lived and loved here, and the heartbeat of Jamaica itself. It reminds me that our stories don't stay in the hills. They travel with us, shaping who we are even when we don't notice. Because night drives like this remind me exactly where I come from. And these hills, these shadows, they remember. Tonight, everything meets here, past, present, and whatever comes next on this long road home. So tell me, what part of Jamaica's night speaks to you the most? Now that we're settled in Kingston, with the night stretched out quiet around us and the traffic lights and gas station lights shine bright in the distance, there's one last Anansi story on my mind. The one that shaped my childhood the most, not the tricks, not the jokes, but the story that explains how stories even reach we in the first place. Long ago, when the world was still young and quiet, humans had no stories, no tales to make the nights brighter, no wisdom to pass down, nothing to ease the weight of living. And Anansi, half man, half spider, always watching, always thinking, saw how sad the people were. So he looked up to the heavens and remembered. All the stories in the world were locked away in Niame, the sky god's palace, stacked high like treasure, more than the sky god could ever use. Anansi spun a long web straight into the sky and climbed until the villages below looked like tiny dots. When he reached Niame's throne, he asked the sky god to share his stories with the people. Niame laughed. Share them? But he didn't want to look selfish, so he set 4 impossible tasks. Capture the deadly hornet swarm, the killer python, the stealthy leopard, and the mischievous forest fairy. Everybody thought Anansi would back down, but he said, "Very well, and when humans tell these stories, they'll tell them about me." He returned to Earth and went straight to his wife, Aso, because Anansi might be clever, but he always had sense to ask counsel. Together they planned. First was the hornets. Anansi used clever tricks to convince the hornets to hide inside a gourd until the storm passed. He corked it shut. One down. As we pass by Hunts Bay Power Plant and Petrojam Limited, coming up to Nutramix, I imagine the hornets hustling into that gourd, all hidden, just like Anansi planned. Then the python, vain as ever. Anansi challenged him to prove he was the longest creature alive. When the python stretched out, Anansi tied him to a stick to measure properly. 2 down next was the leopard. Anansi dug a deep pit and covered it with leaves. When the silent hunter crept by to attack him, the leopard fell straight and Anansi wrapped him in webs. 3 down. Lastly, the fairy. For her, Anansi made a little doll covered in sticky sap and placed a bowl of sweet mashed yam on its lap. When the fairy came and the doll didn't answer her, she slapped it, stuck, and in her fury glued every limb to the doll. 4 down. Anansi carried the hornets, the python, the leopard, and the fairy back to the sky. God Nyame realized he had lost, and he had to honor the deal. So he handed over all the stories of the world and told Anansi to take them to the humans. And from that day, every tale worth telling, every legend, every Duppy story, every lesson wrapped in laughter, we call them Anansi Stories because he's the one who brought stories to the world. And as we drive past these quiet streets, it feels like we're carrying those stories forward, just like Anansi. Because his greatest lesson wasn't just for the long ago world, it's for us right now. To all my brothers and sisters across Jamaica, still rebuilding after Hurricane Melissa, remember this. The sky god didn't just hand Anansi the stories, he gave him a challenge that seemed impossible, a storm to face. And what did Anansi do? He didn't face it with brute strength. He used his wit, he used his courage, and most importantly, he didn't do it alone. He went to Aso. He knew that the biggest tasks are never done by one. That's our story too. Our recovery isn't just about rebuilding what was lost. It's about weaving something new together. With every nail we hammer, every roof we patch, every hot meal shared with a neighbor, we are capturing our own hornets, tying our own pythons, and outsmarting despair itself. We are the storytellers now. And the story we are writing is one of resilience. So let's keep sharing our strength, our hands, our hope. Because just like Anansi, we are small, but we are mighty. And the world will know our story.
The way she took control. She make her brother hate her. Think she's hot like a hater.
As the road opens up and the first lights of Kingston stretch ahead, the night finally exhales. The hills and shadows settle behind us, their stories waiting for the next traveler. My aunt's 9 night is over. The funeral awaits in a few hours, but this drive was its own kind of ritual, a remembering. The rolling calf, the old Higue, the 3-foot horse, and Anansi, my favorite stories growing up. They're more than just tales. They're the echoes of every soul who has ever walked this island. And for a little while tonight, in the silence between heartbeats, we listened, we remember. Walk good and one love.